with our inquiry into what the future relationship with the European Union might look like, and we are keen to hear from you today about the report that you published on how the Canada agreement might be adapted to suit our needs. There's a lot of questions that members want to put to you in the relatively short amount of time that we have available. So as ever, to colleagues, succinct questions and as succinct answers as possible would assist us enormously. Can I begin just on one point to do with Northern Ireland? Because yesterday we were taking evidence from Mr. Carlson, who produced the Borders 2.0 report. And I think I'm right in saying that you made reference to that in a paper. And it's a very specific question, because you suggested it could be supplemented by a three-tier system, and I think this is a summary of what you said. Most of the bulk traffic will be removed from the queues anyway by adopting that. Can I just, given the high bar set for maintaining an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, can you just explain what queues you were referring to?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I mean, the volume of traffic obviously is relatively small in Northern Ireland. It's if you need checks or not is the issue. The AEO system that Mr. Carlson has referred to, it exists. It's an EU system. That means you can just go straight through with a disc. I'm calling for a specialised AEO system as well, and then a customs clearance system on top of that for sort of micro businesses. So as you say, the three levels. But I mean, there are no queues now. Obviously, it's an open border. That's the way we want it. Sure. But I think the queues would be. The checks I would recommend would be at sort of Belfast docks, Dublin docks, well away from the border, at airports, for example, and do it that way. So, I mean, any queuing would be well away from the border. Right,
OK. That is very helpful. Now, can I, just a second question, and we will explore this in more detail, about financial services, because clearly that is hugely important to the British economy. Given your assessment of what the 27 have said, namely that passporting is definitely coming to an end, could you just say a little bit about how you think we can maintain access to the financial services market in the 27 member states and how that might be achieved as part of an agreement?
Yes, thank you, Jack. Under Chapter 21 of CETA, the Canadian deal, you have financial services listed there. That obviously doesn't go nearly as far as we need it to go. However, it is a basis. The actual Canadian model, the SuperCanada model, as I call it, is a basis based on CETA. So you can use Chapter 21 and expand it. I'm recommending the Mark Hoban report, and that is in SuperCanada. The issue of financial services, I mean, the Council has now agreed the principle of adding services in. I would say they're already offering CETA Plus, I would suggest, from Donald Tusk's remarks, because he's offering 100% tariff-free access and no quotas, which is better than CETA, because CETA is 99% and 92% in agriculture. So you're now bolting on the services. I think you can use the model of TTIP to some extent. There's a 52-page paper which was intended to be in the US-EU FTA TTIP. That is a good model, but I think we'll want a lot more than that. But I mean, what I've just drawn from that report, because they're the experts on financial services, I'm not. But in a way, I'm looking at this conceptually as what do you need to do in terms of taking CETA, which is very familiar to the EU, by the way. They're very proud of it. It's the largest ever deal they've done, the Canada deal. And they only voted it through just over a year ago. So it's a good model to base this on. And you can bolt on financial services. In the debate last week in the European Parliament, they again mentioned services that will be part of the package.
Would I be right in thinking that you have argued that there is an inconsistency between what the EU was prepared to agree to under TTIP in respect to financial services and what it has been saying to the UK about what it can't offer in the current negotiations?
Yes, I mean, I've had 9 years in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament, and I was sitting there when they were saying that, freedom of movement must be part of a UK trade deal. And I said, excuse me, we just signed CETA, you just signed the Canada deal, which is 99% access to the EU single market with no freedom of movement and no access fees being paid, like Switzerland, arguably pays fees. Yeah. And there has been a lot of hypocrisy and confusion over this, but I do think they're now on our page, actually, from the language used from the Council in particular, and Mr Juncker as well.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you. Mr Campbell Bannerman, thank you very much for coming in and giving us the benefit of your expertise. You've suggested that strategic partnerships agreement are uncontroversial motherhood and apple pie deals. Could you explain, please?
Yes, this is the non-trade side. I'm using, again, the Canada model. Canada has CETA, which is the trade deal, and then it has a strategic partnership agreement, SPA. And the SPA for Canada has things like foreign affairs, defence, security, justice, all the non-trade aspects. This is very uncontroversial. It's passed through the European Parliament without any real debate. And New Zealand has a similar one now, which is basically the same, which is PARC, which is, again, very along the same lines, and Australia has it. So you're getting a Commonwealth or Anglosphere type arrangement of a trade deal, very like CETA, because 80% of the New Zealand deal, which I'm working on, is based on CETA, and Australia too is using CETA, and Japan also is using CETA to some extent. So you're getting a kind of almost like a sort of Anglosphere arrangement, a grouping of nations. But a strategic partnership agreement, I think, is for all the other good stuff. I call it motherhood and apple pie kind of agreements, because you're mostly on the same page, you mostly agree to cooperate on democracy and security.
Okay. What I want to lead on to from that is that the competence issues become less clear the more details you've got in any agreement. And the SPA covers areas that move you to mixed competence and therefore different forms of ratification.
Yes.
Whereas a straight trade deal is obviously Commission competence.
Yeah.
I wondered what your thoughts are on how technically that will be approached in terms of the EU doing a deal with the UK.
Yes, I mean, it's a good point. The strategic partnership agreement for Canada is pretty light in many ways. It's a fairly thin document. It's headlines, I would say, rather than the nitty-gritty detail. I mean, I take on all of these things. It's quite simple to say that you agree. An agreement is what you agree, and you can have a very large strategic partnership agreement of hundreds of pages, rather than Canada's quite modest 30, 40 pages. But there can be a lot more detail in it, but it tends to be quite headline. It tends to be sort of commitment to good things, working together on defence or foreign affairs, rather than the nitty-gritty. I think it is an issue whether you want that kind of detail in there and how sort of specific you need to make it. And that is obviously part of the debate.
And the question then is, how do you, when you're ratifying, get it ratified in the simplest way? That if you wrap things together, do you then risk having a Walloon problem? Which obviously people are worried about. They want to see the trade deal agreed smoothly, particularly because we'll be making payments in the EU conditional on getting the trade deal. And therefore, if it can be delayed indefinitely by regional parliaments, that would be a problem. And if you separate out the individual elements, can you do most of the part of it that has an economic consequence under Commission consequence, and separate out everything else that has, by and large, less economic consequence?
Yes, the Wallonia problem was when they vetoed CETA, the Canada deal. I think things have changed, and this is quite a fundamental point, and it's not widely known yet, but in every new free trade agreement the EU is doing, like Singapore, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, they want to take investment out of the agreement and treat it separately. That's the investor settlement dispute, the system about that ISDS, and they want to take out portfolio investment. Now, the significance of that, this is the ECJ Singapore judgment, but the significance is that everything else in the trade agreement can then be agreed by the EU only, the Parliament, the Commission and the Council, and you do not have to go to 36, I think it is, regional parliaments like Wallonia. I won't comment on the democratic side of that, but that is the consequence of the ECJ Singapore decision. And it does mean that a UK deal could be agreed very quickly through, like, the Parliament, for example. And that is a major change, whereas in theory, the Canada deal is now being provisionally applied, but it could be at any point one of the regional parliaments could vote it down and it ceases to apply. So you're actually avoiding that issue. When it comes to the SPA, there haven't been any issues really. The park, as I say, the New Zealand one went through quite recently, and Australia too, before the trade deal. The framework's gone through first. And there hasn't been any major issue in the EU. There was a problem in Canada about the EU trying to interfere in trial, the length of imprisonment without trial. It was quite extraordinary for human rights issues. There was a 2-year delay because of that, and the Canadians did not like their interference. And Australia and New Zealand has been held up through human rights issues as well. But I think that's all resolved. And actually the SPA side is actually much more straightforward.
So, if I understand you correctly, because a lot of this has already been done, and a lot of the issues that we would be likely to face have been solved with Australia, New Zealand and Canada, actually both sides of this deal, with the possible exception of investment, are almost ready to go, and the European Parliament, your colleagues in the European Parliament, are now quite relaxed about this.
Yes, I mean, the language they're using is very much our language now, and that is, we'll see what happens Thursday, Friday at the Council, the guidelines. The way the EU works, it's exactly the same process. The Council sets the guidelines for trade deals, and then the Commission negotiates, and then the Parliament has a yes or no. That's as far as the Parliament gets. It's either yes or no to an agreement. So, yeah, I don't see any major problems. I mean, in my evidence, I've actually referred to the fact that if you break down the 30 chapters of CETA, 12 of those you can just transfer straight over, 11 of those need tweaking, and then you've got 7, like financial services, that require substantial revision. But actually, you've got a framework there, and I would also stress that it's not just about the EU. This is these trade agreements from the EU are based on World Trade Organization guidelines, the wider global framework. So, if you look at technical barriers to trade, for example, there's an agreement at WTO level which is reflected in the CETA deal and at all free trade agreements from the EU. And it's the same with intellectual property and public procurement. So you essentially have this grid or framework of WTO agreements anyway, which the FTAs are reflecting. So a lot of it is there and done, and you can point to all sorts of free trade agreements all around the world, successful ones. And of course, Australia did 3 trade agreements with their major partners in 1 year. So the timing aspect, it can be delivered quickly.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I just, on your point about, it was the Singapore judgment you were referring to,
yes,
ratification.
Yeah.
So are you saying to us that as a result of that, that a different approach to ratification will apply henceforth, and that the system that's being used to ratify CETA would in future, for a deal, only fall to the national and regional parliaments in respect of 2 bits? Which is the investor-state dispute and
settlement system.
And one other thing. And is it your understanding that that is what's going to apply from now on? Or is it a matter of choice for the Council or the Commission?
Chair, yes, this is. It comes directly from the EU Singapore FTA judgment at the ECJ, which essentially said, because the whole issue is could free trade agreements be just agreed by the EU and not have to go to all the other parliaments, and like Westminster. And the judgment was, if you take out those two aspects, and this is what's happening with New Zealand, but it's not actually public knowledge yet. It hasn't actually been confirmed, but I know it from the chairman of the Trade Committee, from the contacts I have, and also the ambassador to New Zealand and others, that this is what's happening. But from our point of view, it means the British deal, could be done very quickly and just be authorised by the EU institutions, not 36 parliaments.
Just to follow it up, but might there not be a rumpus when national and regional parliaments discover that the EU is proposing to use that mechanism in future for ratification as opposed to the one that they had understood would be used?
It's entirely possible.
Right,
it hasn't been announced as yet, or it hasn't been confirmed as yet, put it that way. So it's kind of in the system, but it's not been formally acknowledged.
That's very helpful. John Whittingdale.
Can I press you a little bit on both of the aspects that have been discussed already? On this court verdict, it is at the moment an opinion. So what reaction has the Commission given to it? Because certainly Mr Barnier seems to believe that we are continuing on the basis that this will require ratification across every member state.
As I say, what's happening at the moment, it's sort of in the system, but it hasn't been formally acknowledged. But it's certainly the legal advice we've received on the International Trade Committee that this is what's happening now, that as a result of the ECJ, I mean, the legal experts have said, if you take out investment from a free trade agreement, I mean, that might be, you may not decide not to, in which case you will need ratification, but should you take out investment, portfolio investment, I'm told, and ISDS, then that can be done separately as an investment agreement. And of course, you're not talking about one agreement in many ways, you're talking about a host of agreements at the end of the day. Customs agreement potentially could be separate as well as investment agreement, SPA. But the legal opinion is quite clear that if you do take these elements out, and I guess that's a political decision, then it's much more straightforward. I wouldn't, as I say, the democratic implications of that, as the chair has touched on, I would like to comment on. I mean, if we were still in the EU, we wouldn't be happy with it, I'm sure. But that is certainly the legal opinion at the moment that we've received formally at the International Trade Committee.
Okay, well that suggests that a large part of any future agreement actually only requires ratification by the EU institutions. But where the dividing line falls, the Court and the Commission no doubt will continue to debate. But the general principle that we should end up with perhaps an agreement in two parts, one part which is of the exclusive competence of the EU and the rest may require ratification. You see that as a viable way, and we could sign, seal and deliver the first part whilst we're still talking about the second.
Yes, I think it's really worth stating that, I mean, what takes the time in negotiating trade deals? You have to ask that question. And it's negotiating away 19,753 tariffs, which the EU has. And of course, you have all your interest groups, farmers or whatever, that want to perhaps water that down or change that, the removal of tariffs. You've got a problem in New Zealand and Australia on that, where the French industry farming industry is objecting to some of the tariffs being removed in agriculture. But we are being offered a 100% tariff-free and quota-free deal. And, basically we start from with the same legal framework, the same laws. We're convergent. I mean, the CETA deal was delayed slightly by the upper house of Canada having to pass some legislation to fit, and this often happens with trade agreements. We will not have that problem, in which case, in my view, it may seem ambitious, but I do think we could do a trade deal by March next year. And I know that sounds ambitious, but, we're not negotiating away tariffs, we're not negotiating away quotas. There is a TRQ, tariff rate quota issue at WTO, which we're working with the EU on at the moment, that is true. And our laws are convergent, so it's the bolt-ons, it's services we have to really concentrate on, in my view. But if Tony Abbott can do 3 trade agreements, I literally announced in October 2013, 3 major markets for Australia, China, Korea and Japan. They do trade agreements. By April 2014 he had 2, and then actually in November 2014 he had China. But it's possible to do. Obviously you might want to make, you might have to come back for more, and of course free trade agreements are always being added to, and I get involved with that, the International Trade Committee. There's always other bits that are added to later down the line, and that goes on every FTA. So you could do it very quickly. I think that's my main point, and I don't think that's clear, because we're in a remarkable position, because there are no tariffs to negotiate away. It is a very exceptional position.
Okay, so the present position of the government, which is to retain the ambition of agreeing the substance of a trade deal by October of this year, and then to finalise the agreement and to have everything in place, ultimately by the end of a transition period in December 2020. I mean, this timetable you would regard as perfectly achievable?
I do. What I found with free trade agreements, I cover India, and nothing much is happening in India, but I pointed out to the Commission that they had the same negotiator as the United States, and don't they need another negotiator? And the point is, you need resources. If we have the resources and the will and the commitment, then I do believe it's deliverable, because, as I say, this is incredibly unusual, because you're sort of, as President Tusker said, you are you have a free trade area now, and you're just replicating that. You're not trying to break down tariffs and discuss cars or whatever it is, or farming. It's a very different position. I do believe it's achievable, and I think it is better for everyone. We're not negotiating in the implementation period, yes, that it is done by the time I lose my job in less than a year. And hopefully I'll be there to vote on it.
Well, that was the last point I wanted to raise with you, because, I mean, you, as well as somebody who has written and commented on this agreement, are a sitting member of the European Parliament. Whatever the institutional requirements, it looks as if the European Parliament is going to have a say on this. To what extent do you think there is a risk that we spend a great deal of time thrashing out an agreement with the Commission and the Council, but the European Parliament then says, well, we're not just going to be treated as a rubber stamp, we're actually going to want to make comment and propose changes? I mean, could this be stalled in the European Parliament?
I think it is possible the European Parliament could vote against it. I don't know where Mr Verhofstadt will go on this, but I think what's important is Mr Verhofstadt might be the negotiator for the Parliament as such, but every MEP has influences, particularly German MEPs, from their home parties and countries. And I think whatever the recommendation is from Mr Verhofstadt, I think they will do their own thing, to be honest, based on national interest. And it's worth saying we will become the largest single market of the EU once we leave. We have we're the second largest importer of goods, I believe, in the world, after the United States, with 75 billion goods deficit net. So there's a huge incentive to get this trade deal through. And I think my observation, being an MEP, is that people have moved from a state of shock and denial about Brexit to, well, we've got to get the best deal possible. I don't know what happens if Parliament votes it down. CETA was quite close, by the way. The Socialist group went in about 3 directions. Some opposition to free trade as a concept, but in the end, it got through and was done. But I think there's a real imperative to get. As I say, we will be the largest single market, and there's some major traders represented, and they're beginning to put the pressure on German industry in particular.
Okay, thank you very much. Christopher Church.
Thank you. Yesterday, or the day before, the draft guidelines for the next stage of the negotiations, there's been a bit of a surprise that the EU has now wants to include financial services in the potential trade deal. And I wondered if you could comment upon the nature of the constraints that the EU is seeking to impose. For example, reliance still upon equivalence rather than mutual recognition. And when you see this as a breakthrough, and as I think Mark Hogan is quoted in the papers today as saying that it's a recognition by others in the EU that financial services are important for the EU economy rather than just for the UK. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I noted that. There is a battle over equivalence. I'm recommending in SuperCanada, my proposal, the Mark Hoban report, his direction, including a forum regarding mutual recognition and handling sort of divergence, which I think would work well. There has been a move, and I've noticed it in the various debates I've been involved in and tracking this. There has been, the EU is mentioning services more and more. They weren't initially, and they were talking about trying to charge us for access to financial services. But I think what's happening is they are recognising, Deutsche Bank, for example, does need access to the City of London. It borrows an awful lot of money in the City of London. There is more and more of a recognition that it's not a one-way street, that it works both ways. And, European EU industry does need, and companies do need access to the City of London. And I think that is being recognised. I think there will be a battle over equivalence, but they want to keep us as tied in as possible, it seems to me, in a whole number of areas. But I think, there's an outbreak of common sense going on, which is very welcome.
And so, how do you think we're going to resolve the differences about equivalence and mutual recognition?
I think that's going to be debated during the negotiations. I think you're going to have to consult the experts, our experts like Mark Hoban and his team, about what is the best way forward and to argue the case for this. The EU has shifted its position quite a bit. As I say, services weren't mentioned. Freedom of movement had to be part of the deal originally. There's been quite a lot of a shift towards our position. I think that is done at more at the technical level, and it will be influenced at the technical level rather than the political level. But I personally prefer mutual recognition, with more flexibility than equivalence.
And are you able to detect any concessions that the UK has made in order to be able to get this change of approach from the EU?
No, I'm not aware of that, actually. I'm not aware of that from what I know about the negotiations. But actually, a lot of the services side is really quite new. They only started mentioning it, the Council representative in the European Parliament last week, and President Tusk mentioned it on the 7th of March this month, the idea of bolting on services. I would say on services that it's a pretty undeveloped area of free trade agreements. There aren't, the CETA is the best the EU's done in terms of services, but it's not nearly as far as we need for the UK. You don't get services in a lot of free trade agreements. You get elements of them. But the World Trade Organization, through GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, and TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, which is paused at the moment. But the WTO is pushing services at the global level, and that is influencing the EU. And of course, we're taking our seat back at the global level, so we'll be pushing for this at a higher level. But services is a fairly undeveloped area, so a lot of what we'll be discussing is quite new ground. Though having said that, a lot was done behind the scenes on TTIP with America, like access to state services at state level and being able to compete at state level was part of TTIP.
And obviously the United States is a very large market for our financial services businesses.
Yes.
And to what extent do you see the arrangements with the United States as being better or worse than the future arrangements envisaged between us and the EU?
Well, obviously we have a surplus with the US, and we have a massive, well, we have a services surplus with the EU. It's about 13 billion pounds, but there's a surplus with the United States anyway, and a lot of our other trading partners, we have surpluses, mainly services. We obviously have the London-New York bonding, and that is already well established. But I think a US trade deal would expand on that, or a UK-US trade deal would expand on that and bring more benefits in that regard, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for coming in and giving us evidence today. And my questions actually follow on quite neatly from Mr. Chope's questions. I wanted to just get your view firstly on mutual equivalence and your sense of how we can work on a deal for financial services, but how concerned you are that there could be uncertainty with equivalence, and that terms could be withdrawn at short notice in the future that could make long-term planning impossible or at best difficult for the UK financial services industry.
I think that has been mentioned to me as a concern actually in the city, like last night. The danger of withdrawing an agreement. As I say, I go back to agreement is what you agree. We are now in the process. I mean, as I say, I put forward SuperCanada as a basis of this, and Chapter 21, the financial services, and the regulatory side as well. There's 13 and 21. This is an area that can be expanded to address very much your concerns. But this goes on all the time. I mean, Canada did a bit of it with CETA, but anyone in the financial sector will want to seek reassurances within a free trade agreement. I think the more flexibility we have, as I say, again, the Hoban sort of line, I think is a safer position for us than equivalence, and the more we allow the EU to dictate terms and to be able to pull the rug, I think the more insecure it becomes. But I think all of this is negotiable within this wider framework and debatable. And this, you see, my point is, if you're not talking about tariffs and quotas, you can be talking about this, and that's the services aspects. You can be focusing on exactly these kind of issues, and I would say that's what negotiations will actually be focusing on, if we agree that none of the others really applies.
Well, I mean, you do include a substantial section on financial services, as you say in your SuperCanada paper.
Yeah.
I'm just wanting to also understand a bit more about how you see a deal going forward, also mitigating the loss of passporting with the concerns that have been raised. Obviously, 5,500 financial service firms in the UK currently have those EU passporting rights. There are different estimates about how many jobs could be at risk or indeed move from the UK if we do in the end lose passporting rights. Would you have a view about how we could make sure that risk is mitigated?
No, thank you. I mean, my understanding, and I'm not an expert on the impact of EU passporting, but what I'm told, I mean, like an HSBC director last night, is that, obviously big banks like HSBC or big institutions already have a lot of subsidiaries in the EU they can work through, so it becomes less of a problem. They've got EU passporting rights. It's more of an issue for sort of middle-ranking companies that may not have subsidiaries, and I'm told the smaller finance companies or whatever tend to be more UK-based anyway. I think there is an issue, but then, the experts tell me that the city is more about wholesale than retail, and passporting seems to be more about the retail side. As I say, I'm not an expert on this, and I defer to the experts. I mean, I'm looking at this as the wider framework and the concept that you can work, that a lot of the detail can work within. And obviously, when it comes to trade negotiations, you have hundreds of negotiators often who are crunching through a lot of this detail. But the concept is there. You can work within this framework. You can sort these kind of issues out.
Well, if I could ask you just one final question as well. It's in depending on what sort of deal we might get with the EU, the implications for other agreements. The most favoured nation clause in CETA ensures that if the EU offers a more generous deal to another party in a bilateral trade negotiation, then that benefit must be extended automatically.
Yeah.
And similar clauses are included in South Korea, Singapore agreements. What would your thoughts be on that issue?
Yes, thank you. I touch on future MFN clauses in SuperCanada. It is relevant because Canada does have that protection, and Korea, as you rightly say, in Singapore, they can say, well, if you give Britain more financial access or better terms, then we can require those too. I think my view on that is, well, if we open up markets some more, that's a good thing, isn't it? I don't think, the Canadian financial services sector is a player, a big player. I think Korea is obviously more limited. Singapore is a big player. So it is relevant to that, but it's all about market opening, and it really depends, if you're in favour of market access and free trade generally. I don't see it as a problem. And of course, we could have the same. So if any other deal, like if they did do one with the US, the talk should restart, I hear, but then if there's, we will have a future MFN clause in our agreement, so we may get better terms later.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Jacob, I think you wanted to make a declaration.
Thank you, Chairman. As we've come on to financial services, I just want to highlight my chairmanship of Somerset Capital Management and draw attention to my declaration of members' interests.
Thank you very much for doing that. Now, Vera, I think you had just a follow-up question on this point, and then I'll come to Sam.
And thank you for coming to answer our questions. So we understand that one of the big prizes that the government tells us this country is going to have is that we can negotiate our own free trade agreements with other countries. When we actually took evidence from EFTA countries yesterday, and I've asked the question twice now, what different deals are you actually negotiating with the EU? The answer is always, we just follow what the EU gives to third countries. And we want to get as good a deal as the EU gives to third countries. So what is it actually that you believe is the advantage then? What can we negotiate more than what we already have? What would that exactly be?
Thank you. It's a valid point. Obviously, if you have 28 nations represented, which you do with EU FTAs, you represent their interests. And we don't have, I mean, for example, as I was in Peru and Colombia recently on a trade mission, and bananas, orange juice, well, we don't produce that, but Spain does, and therefore Spain, within the EU FTA, wants to keep protection, 20% tariffs on bananas, 20% on orange juice. We, as doing a UK FTA, can say, well, we don't produce this, we're not protecting anything, therefore we can actually just put it to zero tariff.
I'm not talking about bananas and oranges, I'm talking about financial services.
Oh, financial services particularly. Well, I hear from Peru, our embassy in Peru was saying that within actually 24 hours of Brexit, they're on the phone saying, we want a trade deal with you. This is in Peru. And they've identified, at embassy, that financial services is one of the areas. I mean, you've got, I'm told in Lima, you've got like 60,000 students every year learning English. The top schools, the top 19 schools are English type schools. There's a great sort of thirst for British services and produce. So, I mean, I see it's what you make of it. You're opening up the markets, but the EU, I mean, it has its own interests, and German industry obviously is very paramount in the EU. It wants open markets in that sense, but we have financial services as ours.
Can we stick to the advantages, the bigger and better deals we can get on financial services with countries like Peru, for example?
Well, for example, if you take the TTIP analogy, you could open up more local government in Peru. You can actually open up, because a lot of it's quite closed, and Colombia as well. Colombia has 45 million people. It's getting over, fortunately, post-peace process. It's a developing market. But, you know, you can... It's insurance, it's all the financial produce, product service you can sell in. But I think it's more to do with the focus. You know, a British trade deal will be more focused on financial services because our economy is driven by that. Whereas you have many EU nations with different priorities. That's my point. And I think there's some genuinely wonderful opportunities. And by the way, on this note, I understand that the intention now is that we get the EU to roll on existing EU free trade agreements during the transition period until they can be cut and pasted into UK free trade agreements. So I think the intention at the moment is that we don't lose the benefits of what we have, but we can build on it with our own deals. But it's about priorities. You know, each nation has a different priority in terms of an FTA.
Okay. Now, Peter, did you want to, on this specific point?
Yes.
Yes?
Sure. David, I think I heard you right a minute ago in reply to one of your questions. You said, if you take the TTIP analogy, you could open up local government more in Peru. So you're suggesting that if we had a deal with Peru similar to TTIP deal, it would give UK companies direct access to tender for local government services. Does that mean that TTIP automatically gives American companies the right to compete for public service contracts across the United Kingdom?
Well, it depends what you agree, of course. It may well do. I mean, there's always going to be a bit of trade-off or access both ways. But TTIP certainly was looking at opening up state government in the United States, which is obviously very valuable. And in the CETA deal, it is opening up provincial government in Canada to British services more. And I think one of the benefits of free trade is opening up these markets. So, you know, we take it for granted in the EU about tenders, you know, being open to everyone. That isn't the case in many of these countries. But yes, I mean, of course, trade agreements work both ways. And CETA has mutual recognition of professional qualifications, for example, which I think is important in terms of, you know, just recognising Canadian doctors are very much the same as ours.
Okay. Right, but if you're talking about opening up provincial government contracts in America and Canada, does that mean there's then the equivalent opening up of local government health board contracts in the United Kingdom to competition from those?
Yes, it does, if that's what you agree. I don't think, I mean, in a way, we're very open now, you know, under procurement rules, EU-based procurement rules, we're very open to that now. So I'm not sure if it will be a major change in that area. I think it is quite one-sided at the moment because it's quite difficult for British companies to get in, particularly below federal level into state level. And that is something that TTIP really pushed for and was making some progress, though it's quite hard to break into a lot of this and get, you know, British companies being recognised at the state level.
Okay.
Thank you.
Samuel Wilson.
So far. For those who wish to keep us in the EU, the single market and customs union, the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic has become almost like the trump card in their arguments, that you can't have the UK leaving the single market in the EU without a hard border along the Irish Republic with inspections, lorries being stopped, etc. You quote in one of your papers that the Irish have the lowest level of inspections for goods coming from outside the customs union into the customs union of 1%.
That's correct.
Is there any reason why, once the UK leaves the single market and the customs union, that 1% should increase?
No, thank you. I mean, I have Felix Day, for example, in my constituency. We have at the UK level is about 4%, according to World Bank, I think it is, of inspections. So you're not inspecting very much, really. It tends to be intelligence-driven. If they get a tip-off, you know, there's a problem. Or the trusted trader scheme, which is very relevant to Northern Ireland, is basically you check out companies. Do you trust them? I mean, if it's Kerrygold and milk's going one way and butter the other, you know, all year round, you trust them, and you trust them to be professional. If it seems a little bit more questionable, then you will check. But yes, it is staggering. Ireland, our research showed that Ireland is only 1% is checked. It's the lowest in the world, apart from the Gambia, I think. I mean, in my view, the whole issue has been dramatically exaggerated, the border issue. I mean, you had Mr. Carlson, who I think is 85-90% of the way there. It's all solvable, it seems to me. And what I learned from Felix and other ports like Tilbury and Belfast Docks and Dublin I've been to, borders are in computers now, and the HR in Liverpool, like Felixstowe, most of the paperwork, if it exists, is through computers in Liverpool before the containers ever arrive at Felixstowe. And technology, I mean, the EU itself, for its custom code, is insisting on 100% electronic customs operations. So this is the world of customs. It's far more electronic. And I think as long as you have checks away from the border and CCTV away from the border, I would suggest airports or ports, which is what you do for immigration, of course, in the island of Ireland under the common travel area. It's all done at ports and airports anyway. Then you avoid the political issues.
According to the Revenue, Irish Tax and Customs, every day across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, there are about 63,000 heavy goods vehicle and local light goods vehicle movements. But if only 1% of those are being inspected, that's 63 vehicles a day.
Yeah.
Can you see how those 63 vehicles could be handled, or could maybe outline to us how those 63 vehicles could be handled? That's a far cry from the kind of mile-long checks at the border where terrorists could attack the checkpoints, etc. But could they be handled away from the border, so that even that low level of checking could be done unobtrusively?
Yes, as I say, I think those, if you do have to do checks, they should be done well away from the border. In Belfast Docks, Dublin Docks. I mean, I've seen at Dublin Docks all the trucks coming from Holyhead, which then go on the M1, a lot of them up to Northern Ireland A1. I mean, they have all the systems there at the docks and the airports often. And all I'm saying, that I was special advisor to Sir Patrick Mayhew, 96-97, on the peace process in Northern Ireland, and had the honour to serve him. And so the Good Friday Agreement means a lot to me, but I think as long as you keep intrusive checks away from the border area, then it's not such a major problem. And most checks are done in advance, of companies and individuals, and it's backed up by intelligence, as I say. And it's only where you have a problem, a company acting strangely, that they're actually interested in checking them anyway, whether that's Felixstowe or the island of Ireland.
Are there any? Lars Carlson has, with the Smart Borders, has given a number of pointers as to how the frictionless border could be constructed. The government last August had given a paper in which it outlined a number of ways in which a frictionless border again could be obtained. Are there any additional measures, that are not included in either of those two proposals that you believe could overcome the remaining concerns that anyone would have, leaving aside trusted trader, pre-notification, inspections away from the border, CCTV? Any other, from your experience, any other measures which could be imposed to enhance those proposals to ensure a truly frictionless border?
Thank you. I mean, the thrust of the others seems to be along the authorised economic operator and trusted trader schemes, which are up and running, and the AEO is an EU scheme. I mean, my proposal is to add a special all-Ireland scheme, the special AEO scheme, SP-AEO, for sort of intermediate companies, smaller companies. Again, a lot of this is pre-registration, checking people out in advance. You don't want a lot of paperwork or trouble, but once it's set up, it's a bit like the congestion charge, dare I say, which is the third element, is customs clearance, pre-arrival customs clearance. I mean, essentially, if you want to drive into the congestion charge area, you can pay in certain ways. You can pay ahead, you can pay afterwards, 24 hours. Technology provides a lot of solutions, and I think the key thing is let technology do it, but keep the border open and keep any sort of sign of CCTV, etc., away from the border for political reasons.
The EU have said they want a frictionless border as well, but from your knowledge of EU trade facilitation, trade agreements, etc., can you see any reasons why the EU may well insist on the Irish imposing more border checks after we leave inspections, after we leave the EU, than what they're expecting the Irish to do at present?
No, I don't see any reason why. I'm afraid this has been exaggerated for political reasons to keep the UK as close as possible to the EU, whether to keep us in the customs union single market, or to sort of try and tighten up, manage divergence or whatever it is. I don't see any particular issue of that. I think the EU will insist on some kind of system for customs checking which is reasonable to meet its criteria for a border. But I think when it comes down to it, Britain, the Prime Minister's made clear that we do not want a hard border and we're not prepared to actually impose one. So it'll be down to the EU to impose one should they wish. I don't think there's much appetite to do that, but I think really we need to get back to solving the problem. And as you say, the numbers are a lot smaller. Mr. Varadkar went to Canadian-US border, which has an AEO system called FAST, where trucks hardly slow down, I understand. But, when you're talking about US-Canada, that's 370 million people. The whole island of Ireland is, 6.5 million. So, the whole scale of this is much smaller and more manageable, I would suggest.
And you imagine that 63 vehicles a day, inspections could be handled?
Could be handled, yeah.
Just, you've referred twice to doing the checks at ports and airports.
Yeah.
But just so I'm clear, for manufacturers in Northern Ireland and manufacturers in the Republic who are producing goods that then need to cross the border, they're not going to go anywhere near an airport or a set of docks. So how's it going to work for them?
Well, as I say, I think I was suggesting a sort of range of checking centres away from the border.
So there would be other centres that they would have to go to en route? Just for clarification.
Yes, absolutely. But I think the key thing politically is to keep it well away from the border. Yep. But, you can use CCTV on the M1 going up to Northern Ireland, for example, and automatic number plate recognition.
Okay.
But would those checks not be done anyway through the authorised economic operator?
Yes, the AEO is already pre-done.
Okay. Now, Vera, you wanted to come in on this specific point, then I'm going to come to Craig.
On the specific point, because I do believe there is some sort of confusion about what actually container ports do or container loading and what is done between Dover and Calais. Yeah. And also there's a system of cabotage, I understand, where it's multiple sort of opening out of lorries, putting on loads, unloading again. So for container ports, of course, the pre-checking system is very simple. You've got a container, you check it, you clear it, you send it the other way, and it never gets open. The question is, of course, how do you deal with multiple unloading? And I think that has not been explained by what you've been saying.
You're right to say, like Felixstowe is mainly a WTO port, so it's non-EU containers coming from China or Far East into the UK. And actually, as I say, the border is electronic. The paperwork is done basically when the ship's at sea. There is more of a headache when it comes to trucks, Dover, the Irish issue. I do accept that. But, the principle of pre-registering and as Mr. Larson has pointed out, actually having a system where you sort out any issues before you even get near the border, I think that is practical when it comes to Northern Ireland. Again, the congestion charge, you don't need much notice to actually cross the line. And I think that's, at one level that works for the customs clearance level, the sort of very small micro level. But yes, but I do think, rather than just missing technology does have most of the answer, maybe 90%. And again, if we were only checking 1% now, or Ireland is, then the scale of actual checking or needs to check is pretty minor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Craig McKinley.
Yeah, just going back a little. Good to see you again, Mr. Campbell Bannerman. Just going back to the Canada deal, which is a framework which Michel Barnier seems to refer to as a possibility for the UK. It's obviously tariff-free. The problems of rules of origin have been overcome, but it doesn't go as far as you would think common sense would allow in terms of mutual recognition. Now, just focusing on one thing, potentially the REACH proposal. So, a Canadian gypsum manufacturer can obviously export to the EU tariff-free, but that gypsum will have to be tested to the REACH standard, approved in the Finnish authority where it resides. So there is a blockage to that sort of freedom because the EU seems to have a fundamental problem with mutual recognition of standards in advanced countries. And when we've been in the room with Barnier and his officials, there's talk about regulatory dumping, there's talk about tax dumping, social dumping. That doesn't apply in the CETA deal. They seem to have overcome those issues. But on financial services, there was a very clear message that they were concerned about financial stability to allow this sort of mutual recognition of a good banking system in the UK. They seem to have a problem with mutual recognition. Until they can overcome that, I think the EU is showing itself to be one of the big blockages in international trade. Why have they got this concept, and how can they overcome it for themselves, really?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, that kind of argument has been used before. It was used during TTIP negotiations, the same argument, instability to the economic system. I think the EU is more protectionist than the UK is, certainly, and there is an element of resistance in certain areas, and this is part of it. When it comes to REACH, though, I mean, obviously the Prime Minister said that, chemicals is one area where we'll remain very close to the EU. The REACH directive, in my view, is very costly, and of course the full costs are still not quite known because SMEs have got various derogations and exemptions, and that concerns me. But the UK chemicals industry does want to remain very close in terms of REACH, and I'm told by experts that REACH is becoming is being rolled out around the world, or similar REACHs. But yes, mutual recognition, it is in Canada. Again, they can be very hypocritical, where you say, well, hang on, you've just agreed this in the Canadian deal. Did you not read it? And it's... I often find myself having to sort of point that out. And obviously we will have to, if we're exporting to the EU, we'll have to follow its standards. But I think the key point is that only 12% of the UK economy is actual exports to the EU, 12% of the actual whole UK economy. We're exporting more to the rest of the world than the EU, and that the trend is that's going to continue. To the EU will probably fall to about a third or 35% of our exports over the next 10 years, and 90% of growth is outside the EU. So I think we should be more concerned about what's happening outside the EU, and we do have to follow REACH whilst exporting to it.
Now, we're often told that these rules of origin are so infinitely complicated that only a customs union will solve that. Say the South Korea deal. Obviously, South Korea, it's been a bit sort of one single-dimensional, but say they make a lot of electronic products.
Yeah.
And you could assume that quite a lot of those components will have come from potentially China. Now, does the EU just tend to accept that what South Korean Samsung says is in their Samsung mobile phone, Galaxy phone, coming into the EU by the millions, does it tend to accept, yes, it's 50% South Korean product, that's in the tariff-free, and we accept that it's 50% or whatever they're told, that it's Chinese element, of which there is a tariff due. It's just accepted because of a trusted nation. But we seem to be almost told that the UK can't be trusted to do that assessment for itself. How does that actually work in practice in the South Korea trade?
Again, you see, rules of origin are an issue in every free trade agreement, and there are various ways of sorting it. There's a protocol attached to CETA on rules of origin. It's not rocket science, is it? I mean, the point is that, you know, other countries do it. Canada is doing it as we speak. I mean, China exports more to the EU than we do, and there's a rules of origin there. You need to agree these procedures, but again, you know, if you're looking for a model, Canada's a good model because it's doing it now anyway. And of course, it has exactly the same issues because it will export parts from China and the Far East and NAFTA with the United States, there'll be issues there, rules of origin as well. So it's not a new issue. I think you have to agree a protocol, a way of handling it that gets around the problem, and you just apply that, really. And that seems to work in every other free trade agreement.
I mean, are you quite comfortable that, you know, there are some odd borders around the external parts of the EU? I'm thinking about, you know, Poland has got some very unusual borders. It's got Belarus, it's got Ukraine. Now, it obviously has to deal with that rules of origin of something coming in from Belarus.
Yeah.
How reliable do you think that is done? Do you think that it's done reliably? We're told it's done reliably, but are we really confident about that? You know, in real terms.
I don't know the specifics of the Polish border.
It's got more borders, Poland.
But,
really has.
I mean, we're meant to, obviously, I look at the customs union, EU customs is like a fortress, a castle with these walls, and you have these entry points, which is your border. And they should all be the same by rights. There's a common commercial policy, etc., etc. I doubt that is the case, and I'm sure there are some lower grade or some rule breaking going on, presumably. We don't have much evidence of it, obviously, but you know, that is one of the issues. But I think it keeps coming back, you know, if you trust certain suppliers, you know, which are the more regular suppliers, to be honourable, then the system works. And you again, through intelligence, whatever, you go after those that don't.
Well, I think this comes back to the Irish border, that there would be an acceptance in the government's paper last year of a little bit of local leakage. There's local leakage now in terms of VAT differences, drink rates, excise duties, currency. I mean, there's all sorts of differences that are managed. The government paper said, we'll allow a little bit of local leakage, that's fine. But there seems to be a reluctance that Britain as an advanced nation would actually somehow be telling lies across that border. I mean, it just seems fantasy land to me.
It seems to me, you know, what is the point of a customs border, which is what we're talking about in Ireland? The point is to collect duties and to enforce quotas, and maybe there's some sort of animal and SPS type checks and things. But I mean, if you have an FTA which is 100% tariff free and no quotas, then what do we have the same standards at the moment anyway on veterinary, etc. So what is the issue? You know what I mean? I struggle to sort of see what the actual practical issue is. I think there's a lot of smokescreen around this issue, which is unhelpful.
Thank you.
We've got two other colleagues who want to come in because we need to move on to the second session this morning. But thank you very much. Emma Reynolds.
A quick question of clarification. Nice to see you, David. Thanks for coming here. You talked earlier about speeding up the process of negotiation of the free trade agreement by taking investor protection out, as that was something that slowed things down and made it a mixed agreement. But there are other areas, aren't there, of shared competence? For example, I've just got the Article 4 of the treaty in front of me. Agriculture and fisheries are a shared competence, so is environment, consumer protection. If those were part of a free trade agreement, obviously there's going to be quite intense negotiations about both agriculture and fisheries. Wouldn't that make it a mixed agreement and therefore require the ratification of national parliaments and some regional parliaments, not all?
No, thank you. It's a good question, but the legal advice is it isn't. The ECJ has decided that it's only investment that is the problem, and you take out investor-state dispute settlement, you take out portfolio investment. It's exactly the same what was happening to the New Zealand trade deal to speed it up. I mean, it is relevant. Fisheries, obviously, is quite an interesting issue at the moment. I accept that. But, of course, Canada has a large fishing industry, and there was a big row, if you remember, 2005 with the EU over I think they arrested a Spanish fishing boat in their waters in Canada. So you've got all the same issues, and I think this is what you need to concentrate on to get this SuperCanada deal, or what are you going to call it, CETA++, delivered on. But it's all manageable. I mean, when you look at free trade agreements all around the world, Peru, Japan, or Thailand, Chile, or whatever it is, New Zealand, China, there are all these issues there that can get managed, and it is a valid point, but you have to kind of manage it within the actual negotiation process.
But do you accept that it's slightly different, because in some of those agreements you can simply leave things out if you don't want to deal with them, whereas because we've been a member for over 40 years, and many of our policies and our trade is so integrated that actually whatever deal we have has got to cover all these various issues, whereas with Canada and New Zealand and Australia, you can simply leave some of these things out.
Well, you've got very standard clauses in these FTAs all around the world, and CETA has one on sustainable development, trade and TSD, trade and sustainable development. There are issues in that. There are issues about the EU actually trying to enforce environmental standards on us. They're trying it with New Zealand and Australia. And there's pressure to have sanctions, to withdraw trade benefits if you don't follow certain climate change rules or whatever. That is part and parcel of negotiations of all the current FTAs. But it is addressed. I mean, if you look at the chapters of CETA, environment's addressed. It touches on fisheries and lightly as well. And all I'm saying is this is a good framework to work from and to negotiate around, because it's so familiar to the EU, and they've only just passed it, and they're very proud of CETA as well. So I think it's a very good model to work from, and we understand it as a free trade agreement as the UK,
Thank you.
and it's a good basis.
And finally, Jeremy Lefroy.
Thanks very much. Campbell Bannerman. Just two questions really on quite different subjects. The first is, in December last year, the Governor of the Bank of England announced that EU financial institutions or EU banks would be free to continue to operate pretty much as now within the UK after we leave the EU. Now, could you, clearly that was, I think, a very welcome and practical and pragmatic step. Have you noticed that has perhaps slightly changed the dialogue over financial services, that the UK is basically saying, we want you here, actually that benefits your citizens and it benefits our citizens, so pretty much we'd expect you to do the same. Perhaps you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I think it is valid. I think the whole tone has changed. I think from what non-British MEPs tell me, and including the former head of the BDI of Germany, the CBI equivalent, is the EU has been slow to recognise we're their largest single market, and they need access to the city to finance industry and business. I think that recognition is now sinking in, and there's a lot more domestic pressure to say, for heaven's sake, get a good deal. The trade statistics, by the way, there's about 8 EU nations that are responsible for 90% of all EU trade with the UK. Germany has almost a quarter of all of that. We employ about 1.5 million Germans, arguably. But these kind of, what's been going on behind the scenes, I'm very aware of now, is that there's a lot more pressure, and that the council, which obviously meets this week, really represents more and more that sort of domestic pressure from corporations, particularly in Germany and elsewhere, on, well, for heaven's sake, we do need a deal. And yes, there has been a change as a result of that.
And my second question is more on manufacturing. Clearly, in the West Midlands, which my constituency sits within, we actually have a manufacturing trade surplus, one of the few parts of the UK that does, as far as I know. And that relies on very smooth, very efficient supply chains, just-in-time manufacturing. And there's a real concern among businesses in my constituency that rely on those that that has to continue for them to be efficient, because the margins are small. You can't afford an extra 2, 3, 4% on costs. So I wondered how you think that that can be overcome, because, as I say, it's a major concern to manufacturers.
No, thank you, and I recognise that, and I personally think a customs agreement, if that's separate, it might be bound in, but a customs agreement is probably more important than the trade agreement in the terms of just-in-time and hold-ups or whatever. I think a smooth customs relationship is essential. Obviously, we're importing more than we're exporting, so the queues will be longer on the continent than in the UK in that regard. But I take it very seriously, and the customs side is very important to have smooth, just-in-time operation, as you say. I would say, though, that obviously we are importing a lot from outside the EU as part of that logistic chain. I mean, a lot of the components for cars, etc., or manufacturing come from the Far East, with tariffs on them into the customs union, for example. So there's opportunities there, but it is a global system, and as long as there's, you have a good trade deal and a customs agreement, I don't really foresee a problem arising.
And just finally on that, do you, what is your perception of how discussions over a very full customs arrangement are going at the moment?
I think customs is more of a challenge. I think the EU is worth saying, the EU is upgrading its whole customs operation to make it more electronic. The customs code is being improved. Transport by goods document is 1 hour before arrival. That's a target. I think it's more of a challenge, the customs side. I mean, at Felixstowe, I was listening about the chief system being replaced by the new CDS system this year, customs declaration system. I mean, that is due this year, but obviously it would have to be upgraded quite a bit because it's mainly WTO, non-EU at the moment. But there's a lot of opportunities. Again, technology can solve a lot of this, and borders are in computers. But it does take, that the scale of it will be greater, obviously, if the EU is, we're not in the customs union. But, it's all manageable, and we manage it for 56% of our exports go to the rest of the world. We manage it that way, and the imports as well is about the same proportion.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Campbell Bannerman, on behalf of the committee, can I thank you very much for coming and giving your evidence today, which has been extremely helpful.
Thank you.